The BMI Podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast. Today we're going to discuss the blue zones. What are the blue zones? The blue zones are 5 regions across the globe that were found by the National Geographic Society and Dan Buettner, in which the people tended to live longer than other places. And actually, they were the highest concentration of people that lived to be 100 years or older. Today's podcast won't be comprehensive on the blue zones, nor is it meant to be. But I just think it's fascinating what they found and what they've actually tried to then turn around and implement into communities here in the U.S. and possibly abroad. Essentially, what they did was they started to look and do research to try to determine where the hotspots of longevity were. And they assembled a team, including a demographer, a dietitian, an anthropologist, and an epidemiologist. And they went in and they looked at these areas once they found them. And what they had, the way the name blue zones came, was they had a map. And when they would identify these, they would circle them with a blue pin. And then they internally began to call them the blue zones. And since that's expanded out to become a name for these areas. And what's interesting is when they looked at this, they found these 5 areas across the globe. They're not all in one area or even on one continent. There's one in Greece, there's one in Japan, one in Costa Rica, one in Italy, and actually there's one here in the United States. So I'm going to discuss briefly just a little bit about the 5 blue zones. And then once we kind of know where they are and kind of get a little background on them, I'm going to discuss what Buettner and his team have gone in and deciphered. What they did was they went in and they looked at these 5 areas and they studied them over the course of a decade or longer. And they took that team and they started to extract data from them. For one, they verified their ages, but then they also started to just look at their lifestyles, their diet, their activity, their relationships. And they found the commonalities amongst these 5 areas. And they call them the Power 9. And so we'll discuss those. Those are the 9 characteristics that are present in these that they feel lead to the longevity and the likelihood of making it to 100. Now, I don't think any of these areas have a stated goal or at any point intended to develop centenarians. They just have a lifestyle and they've just created an environment where they're not having to struggle against the environment. They're able to work in such a way that's healthy, that works for them, where their diet and their ability to move and exercise just comes naturally. It's just their ability to make the easy choice, which also happens to be the healthy choice. And over time, that leads to more happiness, a better diet, more exercise via natural movement, and then consequently, fewer chronic diseases, longer lifespan, and more importantly, longer health span. We've talked a little bit about the difference between lifespan and health span. Lifespan is from the time you're born till the time you die. It's simply a matter of quantity of days, months, or years. Health span to me is really from the time you're born until the time you're functionally unable to do the things you want to do because of chronic disease, right? Whether it's obesity, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, pick your ailment. Your health span, when your health begins to dictate what you can and can't do, that's probably a good marker for when the end of your health span is, but not necessarily the end of your lifespan, right? You may live to be 90, but if you're only healthy and able to participate and do the things you want to do up until the time you're 70, you've just added 20 years that really isn't as meaningful as you would probably like it. It really looks like these centenarians in these 5 blue zones not only have a long lifespan, but they also have a long health span. It almost looks to me is that their lifespan and their health span essentially go 1 and 1, right? They are the same thing. They live healthily into an old age and then pass away. So let's talk about these. The first one is Nicoya in Costa Rica. It's the only South American blue zone, and it actually has the lowest rate of middle-age mortality. And it has the second highest concentration of centenarian men, or men that live to be 100. When it comes to healthcare costs, Nicoya spends about 15% of what America does, and yet they have approximately 2 times higher likelihood of making it into your 90s in a healthy state. Something that's very important to the Nicoyans is faith and family. And we'll see these 2 characteristics really play out through all of these zones. That faith and family tend to have a meaningful impact on our ability to live long and to be happy. Their diet really consists of no processed foods. They have a lot of fruits and vegetables. They eat a diet low in meat consumption, which again is a commonality that we'll see. They have what's called a plan de vida, which is a plan for life or a purpose of life. And I don't know that it's a stated purpose of life, but they just focus on that and they just have a greater purpose, greater than their self-interest. And really, that seems to be another common thread that we see that is woven throughout these different communities. So that's Nicoya in Costa Rica. Next one is Ukaria, Greece. Ukaria is a tiny island off the coast of Turkey. It actually also has a very low rate of middle-aged mortality. It has the lowest rate of dementia, and they essentially have almost no dementia at all. They have a 20% lower incidence of cancer. They have a 50% lower incidence of heart disease. They eat primarily a Mediterranean diet. And they participate in what Dan Buettner has determined a downshift daily, where they actually take a nap. They have sort of like the equivalent of a siesta, where they rest and take a nap daily. And we do know from Western studies that people who take a nap daily have about a 35% lower incidence of heart disease, likely due to lower stress levels circulating throughout the day. So that is Ukaria. So the next one I want to talk about is the only blue zone here in the United States, and it's in Loma Linda, California. The interesting thing about Loma Linda is it's home to the biggest concentration of Seventh-day Adventists. And so the Seventh-day Adventists really emphasize the importance of healthy living, including diet and lifestyle. And they view this as part of their commitment to their God. And so it becomes just a natural part of their life. And likely what you'll see is in that community, they have taken down barriers to making healthy choices, which makes the healthy choice the easy choice. And I think throughout all these blue zone communities, you'll see that that is a phenomenon that is present that we don't necessarily have in the rest of the world, but we really ought to look to implement. So the Seventh-day Adventists, they believe in downshifting, not so much on a daily basis, but they believe in holding the Sabbath day holy. So they downshift for a full day on Saturday, their Sabbath day. In Loma Linda, it's estimated that they live approximately 7 to 10 years longer than the average American. Their diet basically was pulled from the Bible, and it consists of a vegan or vegetarian diet, although that is not a requirement of the church. But again, they view diet and lifestyle as part of their commitment to God, so they tend to eat healthier. Even dating back to the 1890s, one of the brothers that originally founded Cornflakes actually designed this as a healthy alternative and a way to help live a vegetarian lifestyle. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. It was designed by the two brothers. John Harvey Kellogg was a physician, and he actually invented this in a sanatorium, and it was kind of a mistake that he invented it by. But it turned out to be good, and he thought there were some benefits to morality, that by eating these, it could keep you from doing different things, and it's an interesting story. His brother, on the other hand, wanted to capitalize on it and ultimately added sugar and created what we know today as cornflakes and the Kellogg cereal company. So my point of that, though, is he was affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As early as the 1890s, we have documentation of their desire to eat healthy and to just live a pure lifestyle. So the fourth of the 5 blue zones is Okinawa, Japan. It's a South Pacific island. It's actually home to the world's longest living women. And they believe in what's called moais. So when they're about 5 years old, they're assigned to a group of 5 people, themselves and 4 other people. Those people are committed to one another in a social network. And I think originally it might have been designed in case there were financial problems, not in the sense that we know them, but if they were struggling with food or shelter. And it's just gone on to be a organized community for each individual. And they take it very serious and they're very involved with it. And again, it gets to that sense of community and purpose. They also have what's called an ikigai, which is their reason to live, their reason to get up. Very similar to the Nicoyans' plan de vida. It's a purpose for life, and it's a bigger purpose than just whatever you have on your to-do list for that day. They have a very strong sense of family, and their diet is consistent with the other diets that we've discussed, but they also invoke a mantra called Hara Hichibu that basically says that you eat till you're about 80% full and then you stop eating. And so by taking in less food, you're actually probably, you're restricting your energy intake and you're moving more. And so that's why so many of these people are so healthy, because they're not carrying that extra weight. They're not developing these chronic ailments, arthritis, heart disease, diabetes. They have a lower incidence of cancer. And a lot of it is just related to weight control, probably. The last of the 5 blue zones I want to discuss is Sardinia, Italy. And it's a coastal town, and it's home to the highest concentration of centenarian men. It's a mountainous area. There's a lot of shepherds, and it's estimated that they probably all walk approximately 5 miles a day in this mountainous region. They have a plant-based diet. and they do eat meat occasionally, but it tends to be reserved for Sundays and special occasions. They actually drink wine in a moderate amount, and it's a particular type of wine called Cananao, and it's very rich in flavonoids. So these 5 areas, Sardinia, Nicoya, Ikaria, Loma Linda, and Okinawa, they're span across the globe, but they all have a higher incidence of their citizens making it to 100. So the National Geographic Society and Buettner went in and looked to see what did these 5 regions, which geographically don't have anything in common, culturally they don't have a lot in common. There's really a lot of just disparity between these, but there tends to be a higher concentration of people that make it to 100. And so what was the commonalities? And that's what they did their research. And this research spanned a decade or longer. And so they found 9 commonalities amongst the 5 regions, and they termed it the Power 9. So the first of that is that they all move naturally. All of these regions tend to move naturally. They get a lot of exercise, but not in the form of exercise as we know it. Right, our last podcast, we talked about doing a fun run or a 5K, 10K, running a marathon, signing up for CrossFit, getting a bicycle and doing it either recreationally or involved in a race. In these 5 zones, their days are just set up where they walk. The Sardinians tend to live in a mountainous region, and they just walked about 5 miles a day. And so all of these regions tend to walk and move on a regular basis. They also tend to grow their own gardens. And so they're just out there working the gardens. And many of them are using hand tools. And so there's just this natural movement, this propensity to move naturally amongst all of these 5 communities. The second thing they have in common is they have this purpose, this greater purpose other than just themselves and just their daily to-do list. Right? The Okinawans have the Ikigai. The Nicoyans had the Plan de Vida. But they all have these driving factors for why they wake up in the morning and what their purpose is. So a sense of purpose factors in strong amongst all 5 of these. This ability to downshift and to de-stress on a regular basis also seems to be very important in all 5 communities. The Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, and probably others in Loma Linda as well, they just celebrate the Sabbath, right? They just downshift and they take that day off and they recognize that as a day of rest. The Ukarians tended to nap daily. So this ability to de-stress and to take time for yourself and to take time to rest and to sort of get out of the rat race is another commonality. The 80% rule, right? This idea of maybe some caloric restriction. Not that they have a set goal of caloric restriction, but just their lifestyle leads to caloric restriction. The Okinawans say the mantra of Hara Hachibu before they eat, which is a 25-year-old Confucian mantra that just reminds them to eat till you're 80% full and then stop. Again, if you stop when you're 80% full as opposed to just gorging yourself, you're very likely to be calorically restricting. And we do know from Western studies that caloric restriction does tend to lead to a longer life. The other thing that's interesting amongst all 5 of these regions is they tend to be sort of plant-based. Maybe not pure vegetarian or vegan, but Mediterranean diet. They tend to stress less meat in their diet. Now, there are so many benefits to a plant-based diet, but there's also a popular diet out now called the carnivore diet, and we're going to discuss that as well. What I know is you can find data to support or refute basically anything you want. You can find information out there to tell you that an apple is the best thing you could ever eat, but you could also probably find information out there to tell you everything that's bad about it. It's tough to know, and it's tough to argue when you're looking at all these different diets as to which one is best. But what we can do is we can look at this group of people. I can't point to a study or a graph or anything right here in this that says this diet is clearly better. But what we can do is anecdotally look and say that we have 5 regions across the globe, and they all kind of have this similar diet, right? This sort of plant-based Mediterranean diet, less meat. And these people tend to live longer and healthier. So just anecdotally, we can extract that some of this is related to it. Dan Buettner has a book called Blue Zone Solutions where he actually goes into more of the dietary commonalities that these zones have and also presents various recipes associated with it. It's a great book and I highly recommend it. Another thing that they tend to have in common, maybe with the exception of Loma Linda, is they all tend to drink wine. Approximately 1 to 2 glasses of wine on a daily basis, usually with friends, usually in a social setting, and oftentimes with food. And it's interesting, they have such a strong sense of community, and they all tend to eat healthy, and they drink wine, and they likely do those together. So much of our social interaction is done around a table. We get together with friends and we eat, or we go out to eat with our family. right? And so if you have a group that eats similar and tends to eat this healthy diet as described in these 5 zones, and they tend to have this strong family and community connection, and they drink wine together, right? It just leads to a happy feeling and a general sense of happiness and a purpose of life, that all these things are all woven together that seem to lead to these 5 areas, these 5 blue zones. Being in the right tribe, just this sense of having your people, right? Not only your family, but just your people. The Moais, as the Okinawans have, this sense of 5 people that grow together, and they're there for each other at all times and in all places. You don't necessarily have to have a Moai, but just you have your people. You have your regular friends that you can call. You're there for them when they need you, and they're there for you when you need them. That sense of connection, that sense of community makes a big difference. And that's common. This right tribe, this sense of community within all of these. And then in that, there's also a religious slant to the community. So Buettner talks about in one of his books that of the 263 centenarians that he interviewed, all but 5 of them were involved in a faith-based community. And it didn't matter what the religion was or what the denomination was, just the fact that they were involved in a faith-based community where they participated about once a week. That seemed to add anywhere from 4 to 14 years to their life. And then a sense of family. That seems to be maybe the strongest thread throughout. Definitely it looks like they put families first. The Okinawans actually, not only do they downshift daily, but they actually do it in such a way where they honor their ancestors, where they think about family members that have died. But for those of them that are alive in all of these blue zones, they don't tend to let the parents age and then dissociate from them or leave them, right? They tend to bring the parents and the grandparents into the home. And not only that, but they honor them and they revere them. And it looks like the kids actually tend to do better by being around the older people. They also tend to commit to a life partner, and that, having a single life partner, seems to add about 3 years of life. So those are the 9 common characteristics that the 5 blue zones have. And let me just go over those again. They move naturally. They have a sense of purpose. They downshift. They tend to calorically restrict or have this 80% rule. They have a little bit of a plant-based or Mediterranean diet. They all participate in wine, maybe with the exception of Loma Linda. They tend to be involved in the right tribe, or they tend to have a sense of community within their friends. They tend to put their loved one first, and they tend to have a faith-based connection. Once they gathered this data, they took it a step further and they looked to kind of see if they could recreate these zones in other places. They started by just kind of determining what needed to be done. And they did research and they found that individuals tend to spend about 90% of their lives within a 5-mile radius of their home. So they called that the life radius. And then they worked to go in and just start to engineer the environment in such a way that people were working in concert with their environment and they weren't having to work against it. So they started just by making recommendations at the individual level, things that people could do at their home or in their kitchen so that they could eat fewer calories and maybe exercise a little bit more, maybe not in the form of exercise, maybe just in the form of this natural movement that we talked about. They made recommendations like putting a bowl of fruit on the counter, or serving food at the stove instead of at the table, or using hand tools instead of mechanical tools for yard work. And there was about 115 recommendations that they ultimately ended up coming up with. They did find that when they started studying that about 80% of people in any given community wanted to change their health habits. So it looks like society as a whole understands the predicament we're in, but when you look at it, it's just harder to work against the environment that we're in. Here in America, we work long hours and stress, and there's a lot of emphasis on productivity and money making. And some of the things that are really important, like health and family and a good diet, are really pushed to the side in an effort to achieve those. And I think they can coexist. You just have to be intentional about it and work to have healthy lifestyles, even in a productive life. They looked at a handful of communities, and they landed on the community of Albert Lea up in Minnesota, where they went in there and they basically just made policy recommendations where they tried to affect some of these Power 9 characteristics, these characteristics that are common throughout the blue zones, into an American community. And it's interesting, they had to get a lot of buy-in from different levels, right? They got grocery stores to buy in, they got restaurants to buy in, they got the school system to buy in, and they actually got some commitments from individuals, right? All of these people, the schools, the restaurants, the grocery stores, the individuals, they all made pledges, right? There was nothing to hold them to it, But they basically did it. And what they did was they asked the grocery stores to, instead of having Coke and Pepsi and all the soda pop and candy bars at the checkout of a grocery store, to have fruits and vegetables and water. And they made some recommendations on how to arrange the grocery store. And the grocery stores were agreeable. They'd made the pledge. And then restaurants, they agreed to have at least 3 healthy entrees, 3, I think, plant-based entrees. And then they also made the default side when you ordered a meal at the restaurants to be fruit and not fries. So just tiny little things, just like we've talked about before, just tiny little changes that we make that make life easier and make the healthy choice the easier choice. They also asked schools to commit, and the schools pledged, and one of the things they did was they didn't sell candy for fundraisers, and they didn't use candy for rewards for good activity and good work. They also changed some school rules based on a University of Minnesota study where they looked at prohibiting eating food in the hallways and in the classroom. If you implemented that rule based on this study, it looked like you could have an approximate 11% per year drop in the student BMI. And so the schools adopted that policy. And then 25% of the community signed a personal pledge that they would just take steps toward healthier lifestyles. They implemented these, they had policy buy-in, they made environmental changes, and about a year and a half into it, there was a little bit more than a 3-year extension of life expectancy. And that community lost a combined weight of 7,280 pounds, and they had healthcare costs drop by 40%. Can you imagine across the U.S. if we could make all of these changes, or just some of them, right? Just implement them into these cities, the weight loss that we could see and the healthier choices that would be made and the longevity that would be gained and the decreased costs in healthcare, right? So much of our healthcare is just managing chronic disease, mostly related to our diet. So Albert Lea was the first one that they did, as I understand. But I think there are other communities out there that have adopted it, and maybe not in a formal way. But you can actually look at Buettner's data, and he's gone to different cities, and they've worked to implement them. And some cities are just naturally aligned toward healthier lifestyles. It's interesting, Colorado has the lowest obesity rate in the U.S. secondary to D.C., but in terms of state, it has the lowest. West Virginia has the highest. And I think if you go in and look, you'll see that a lot of these barriers to healthy choices are down in Colorado and probably higher in West Virginia. In Europe, a lot of cities are more walkable, right? Mass transportation is just different. When you get into these big cities, like Houston or Oklahoma City, LA, you have these big cities that just have sprawling land masses, and it's very difficult to walk, right? You can walk, of course, locally, but if you really need to get somewhere, it becomes a much bigger ordeal. And so you end up driving. So they have these, big highways and huge parking lots. And when you look at Europe, you see a lot less of that. And so they're more walkable cities. And so a lot of cities have really begun to shift to making bike lanes and to make them more walkable. I think oftentimes they're built in and it's a subtle change, but over time it'll make a difference. And so if you have the ability to affect policy in your community, you ought to look at Buettner and his plan that could be implemented. Even if you can't implement the whole thing, if you can just implement part of it, I think it would be so beneficial to the community. But if not, just look at what you can do within your own home, right? Within your kitchen. And when you can walk. And when you can ride a bike. If you can just quit struggling against your environment, if you can set your environment up to where you're not struggling against it, but rather working in concert with us, I think you'll see that you can get a lot of the benefits that these people in these blue zones have gotten. It's interesting. You can go to their Vitality Compass. You can actually go in and it asks you, it's about a 5-minute survey. And they ask you all sorts of questions about, of course, your age and your height and your weight and actually your zip code. But then they also ask, how many fruits do you eat a week? How many vegetables? What are your social contacts like? What's your family life like? And then in the end, it gives you information. It tells you what the average lifespan in your community is. And then it tells you what yours is based on the answers to those questions. And then it makes recommendations of what you can do to maybe expand your lifespan or hopefully your health span. So that's basically all I wanted to bring forward. Again, I want to just emphasize that these people in these 5 communities, these 5 regions of the globe, don't have to struggle against the environment. And consequently, in those communities where they're not struggling against their environment, we're seeing clusters of people who live to be 100 or grow old without chronic disease such as heart disease, obesity, cancer, and diabetes, all based on the Power 9. I hope you found today's podcast interesting and will be able to implement some of those things into your life and maybe your community if you have the ability. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then.